Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program. In the beginning was the word, first wine writers of California. We're just letting participants in from the waiting room right now. So if you'll be patient, we'll be getting started in just a minute or two. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online webinar. In the beginning was the word, first wine writers of California. We just have a few more folks entering from the waiting room, so we'll be starting this webinar in just a few minutes. You'll probably just have silence for a minute or two. We'll be back shortly to start. Thanks. I do think we'll have some folks joining us a little later in a few minutes, but we're going to get started here. Again, good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program. In the beginning was the word. First wine writers of California, Frona Eunice Wait and Leon Adams, presented by Axel Borg and Jullianne Ballou. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar this evening. Tonight we have more than 110 people joining us for this presentation based on our reservations. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. Many of you know that the book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We also host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much more. So if you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply cannot do what we do without the support of our members. I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our speakers. The program, In the Beginning was the Word, the first wine writers of California, Frona Eunice Wait and Leon Adams, is going to be presented by Axel Borg and Jullianne Ballou. The first wine guide to California wineries was Wines and Vines of California, or a treatise on the ethics of wine drinking, written by Frona Eunice Wait in 1889. The first major writer after Prohibition was Leon Adams. His book, The Wines of America, in 1873, going into 4 editions, played a major role in educating Americans about wine. Both were Californians and were first in promoting California wine. So those are 2 major California wine writers and 2 quintessential symbols of culture, wine, and books. And tonight, we're fortunate to have 2 wine scholars with us to talk about these 2 incredible figures. Axel Borg is the Distinguished Wine and Food Science Bibliographer Emeritus at the University of California, Davis, and Jullianne Ballou is the Warren Winiarski Wine Writer Collection Fellow special collections at the Shields Library at the University of California, Davis. They're each going to tell you a little bit more about their work and tonight's program in a minute. If you have questions for our speakers, though, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we will curate those from the Q&A. So again, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Axel Borg and Jullianne Ballou and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Jullianne, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was such a wonderful introduction. As Kevin mentioned, Axel and I are so happy to be doing this program and participating. And we wish we could see everybody's faces, maybe sometime in the future. So as Kevin said, I'm the Winiarski Wine Writers Collection Fellow. I've been at the UC Davis Library since January 2019, and I was hired to manage the Wine Writers program and build a collection of papers of major wine writers, not just in California, but throughout the United States, and in some cases internationally as well. When I got to the library, UC Davis already had a wine writers collection that included the papers of Leon Adams, whom we'll talk more about later in this presentation, Charles Sullivan, Jancis Robinson, Hugh Johnson, Roy Brady, and who am I missing?
Bob Thompson.
Bob Thompson. Very important. So this collection has largely been built on the premise, the idea that better words make better wine. A saying by the vintner Warren Winiarski, who's a major supporter of the program. And Warren's idea, along with the library, was that the California wine industry and the consumer industry, and also the winemaking side of it, developed alongside each other, and were bolstered by articles about wine, wine journalism, wine criticism, that today continues on largely in the form of blogs and social media, but wine journalism is still alive and thriving. So this collection hopes to capture the history of wine writing, mostly in California, but also beyond California. And going forward, we'll move even more into the digital sphere. And we're doing a lot of website archiving and archiving of born digital material, as well as archiving of papers. Axel, you want to take it from here?
Oh, I'm Axel Borg. I'm the wine guy in the library. To sort of simplify things, I'm technically a post-harvest agriculture librarian. So what that means is my colleague who is a plant science librarian, once you harvest the plant, or my colleague who is the animal science person, once you butcher the animal, then that's mine, it's my territory. But a big area that I worked in, an important area that I worked in within that area, was grape growing and winemaking. And UC Davis has the finest grape growing and winemaking collection in the world. It's really quite astounding. Over 30,000 volumes, over 50 different languages in the collection. So I've had the privilege and honor of working with that collection for, I have to do the math now, well over 30 years, 33 years. So in that, I got, what it meant was I got to learn about the collection, the kinds of things that were in the collection, and publishing patterns. The collection ranges from popular to include wine humor, all the way through to really hard, dense scientific works. So why these two people? Why Frona and why Leon? I think they're names of wine writers that we don't know. largely in California today, which is a shame, because both of them played a huge role in educating the public about wine, and through their education and promotion of wine really helped promote and grow the California wine industry. So Frona was born Eunice Sofrona Smith in Woodland, California. Woodland's up by Davis in the Central Valley. She went by Frona all her life. She was married 3 times. She began her career as a journalist with the Santa Rosa Republican about 1880. And by 1887, was working as a journalist for the San Francisco Examiner. She was one of 2 women journalists. And she got the attention of Ambrose Bierce, Bitter Bierce. He even wrote a poem about her called A Competitor. So it must have been that he held her in at least some esteem. Her writings are wide-ranging. She wrote a fictional prehistory of San Francisco with an Atlantean theme called Yerma the Dorado, the story of a lost race. It was originally published by William Doxey in 1897. William Doxey, of course, published, he was a notable San Francisco bookseller and publisher. And he did The Lark, a magazine of journalism, or of literature, I should say. And there was a book by Robert Harlan about the Lark, published by the book club. In 1913, the story was updated to include the San Francisco earthquake, or bring that into the story. So she was keeping it relevant. Her book, Wines and Vines of California, a treatise on the ethics of wine drinking, initially claimed that it was endorsed by the Board of State Viticultural Commissioners, which it was not, and she had to issue a retraction. She published an article in Out West magazine about John Henry Nash, the famous printer in San Francisco. And she was quite a wide-ranging and remarkable woman. And I find it quite remarkable that she also published a pamphlet in 1915 entitled 80% of the Women in California Do Not Want the Vote. So she was an anti-suffragette, but it was published in Pennsylvania. So that's interesting also. Frona promoted California wine by a number of different ways. Her book, of course, and then articles that she wrote. But she also gave a speaking. She went on a speaking tour and had lantern slides to illustrate her talks. And are we moving on to the let's move on to the lantern slide. Oh no, here's her book. So here's the title page of her book. And so she gave a talk. There were 85 different lantern slides in this collection. They've all survived. She gave them to Maynard Amerine, who was a faculty member at UC Davis and a mentor of mine when I first started. And he in turn gave them to the Napa Valley Wine Library, where they presently reside. They have been digitized, and with the permission of the Napa Valley Wine Library, I'm going to use 4 tonight. So let's go to the next one. This is very interesting photograph for a number of reasons. This was taken in Charles Krug Vineyard, which is just north of St. Helena. And if you look carefully at the photograph, which has been colorized, you will see that there are at least 2 Chinese workers in the field. And a man by the name of William Heitz, who was a wine researcher, wine historian, wrote his master's thesis on the Chinese contribution of Chinese to California viticulture. And the books that we're mentioning here, there will be references to those that Kevin will send out later on, so that if you're interested in following up on that, you can track these things down. So it shows that there was a diversity in the field picking, certainly, and the contribution of the Chinese to California viticulture is immense. Moving on a bit, in the St. Helena post office is this mural that was done in 1942 by Lou Keller, entitled "The Grape Pickers," and all white males. I don't think this is an accurate representation of what was going on at that time, but it is a beautiful WPA mural, and it is on the wall inside the St. Helena post office. So if you're ever up in St. Helena and have an interest in this kind of art, it's worth taking a look at. In 1992, we'll go to the next slide, or in the 90s, a local group felt that there needed to be a more accurate representation. And so in this case, we do see that there are both men and women and children in the field picking grapes. Both of the murals have as a center of focus in the background the white shed. And it's important to see the evolution and understand the labor behind California agriculture. So let's move on to the next slide. This one is Chateau Chevalier. It is the winery is still there. It is owned by Spring Mountain, and it is in the burn zone. It is in the glass fire burn zone, but just right before we got on, I checked to make sure that it in fact had survived. And the reason that it survived, the reason that they're attributing it, the building's survival, is that it was built out of stone with slate roof. So someone back in the 1890s or late 1880s, 1890s in Napa was actually building to fire code, which is a good thing. So let's move on. This is a view of Inglenook Vineyard. And what we're looking west towards Bear Canyon. I'm going to read a section here from Frona's book about Inglenook. The Inglenook Vineyard is situated in the heart of Napa County, which, with Sonoma, is partially named is justly named the Bordelaise of California. Surrounded by the majestic foothills of the Coast Range, sheltered from strong winds and coastal fogs, it nestles among the towering forest-covered hills, deserving well its name of Inglenook, Scotch word for fireside. The estate proper consists of about 1,120 acres of arable land of diversified soils, well watered by mountain streams, whose life-giving properties fertilize the soil and sprinkle the silver threads through the canyons, adding an indescribable charm to the enchanting landscape. What we're looking at is where the winery would be, and this is currently owned by Francis Ford Coppola. Inglenook, the winery, had been established by, really built up by Gustav Niebaum, who was a Finnish sea captain in service of the Russians and had made his fortune in the fur trade. He had a mansion in San Francisco that was burned down in the earthquake. His winery eventually went to his grandnephew, John Daniel, and he was active in the immediate post-war period of World War II and was really kind of considered the Robert Mondavi of his age, in that he was advocating the excellence production of Cabernet Sauvignon. Photographs like these are really important to, especially to landscape historians, because they show how the land has altered over time. And so to have something that we can, do a comparison now and then, it helps us understand, especially how areas like Napa, which are highly developed, have changed over time. So the last one that we have is Cresta Blanca. And again, reading from Frona's book on this, higher up in the valley is Cresta Blanca, vineyard of Mr. Charles A. Wetmore, president of the Viticultural Commission, as well as the chief executive officer. Cresta Blanca is a remarkable looking place. It is almost cut in half by a high ridge and lies in the very head of the valley, and it is well sheltered by the surrounding hills. The tract consists of 480 acres and takes its name from a particular rock formation which forms the highest cliff on the place. This white crest can be seen for quite a distance, and is one of the marked features of this singular looking farm. It goes without saying that Mr. Wetmore has plowed, planted, and built well, and his souvenir, in quotes, wines, especially Medoc and Sauterne, are already celebrated. Mr. Wetmore has the courage of his convictions, and when he has advised small packages and stone cellars, he has set a good example of boldly tunneling into a ridge which runs near the winery. And this has rolled the puncheons of the fine wine into the storehouse thus provided, there to age and perfect in undisturbed temperature. Now this Mr. Wetmore, Charles Wetmore, was the president of the Board of State Viticulture Commissioners, whom she claimed she had an endorsement, which she didn't. He's a very important person in that he lobbies the University of California. He lobbies the state legislature. He's actually a student at a small college called College of California, and it's in Oakland. It's downtown Oakland. Last I was there, there's a historical marker, and it's a parking lot. But it is the site of the original buildings that became the University of California. College of California was going bankrupt. Wetmore lobbied the California state legislature to buy this for the University of California as a land grant institution. And the story is he got his senior year for free because he successfully got the state to buy out College of California. Wetmore is one of the first 12 graduates of the University of California. Of course, they're all male. There's a wonderful photograph that you can Google, 12 Apostles, University of California. They're the first 12 graduates. He read law afterwards, became a lawyer, got involved in real estate, and through real estate got involved in vineyards, and then through vineyards got involved in wine. And by the late 1870s, 1880 in particular, the state was in a crisis with the phylloxera problem, the disease or the bug that was attacking the vines. And so the state appropriated $10,000. Well, it created the Board of State Viticulture Commissioners. It charged the University of California with doing research in the area of phylloxera and grapes and wine to benefit the state wine, or the wine industry in the state of California. So Wetmore is a major player in this. His wines do win awards very early on, and he's a very interesting historic figure in all of this time period, this early time period. And again, this photograph shows landscape and is very useful. In fact, I'd say invaluable for landscape historians who are trying to understand what has remained the same and what has changed. So now moving on a bit, Leon Adams. Leon Adams, his mission was to civilize American drinking and to teach Americans to use wine. So I'm going to turn it over to Jullianne at this point.
But Axel will help me with this because he actually had the opportunity to meet Mr. Adams when he donated his papers to the library. What year was that, Axel? Was that 1989?
No, that was, I think 91 or 92. He died in 94.
Okay. So Adams was very interesting. He was born in 1905 in Massachusetts, lived in the Valley of the Moon in California for a few of his early years. And he became interested in journalism and writing as a high school student, and found a mentor at the San Francisco Daily who essentially invited him to move out to the Bay Area to write for the newspaper. So Adams decided to enroll in apply to Berkeley. He was accepted. He moved to Berkeley, and he started writing for San Francisco newspapers. Ended up dropping out of Berkeley to write full time. He was really bitten by the bug. And he realized during that period that newspapers were really these like gossip zones. And he decided that he wanted to do something meaningful with his life because he had this platform. So he found his cause after reading a pamphlet called The Fight for True Temperance by Andreas Sparborough, who founded the Italian-Swiss colony, the winery. And in the pamphlet, or the booklets, Sparborough basically said wine is a temperate beverage. There's nothing dangerous or extreme about it, especially if it's consumed with food. So Adams decided that he wanted to teach Americans, or at least lead a movement dedicated to teaching Americans how to enjoy wine moderately with food. He was instrumental in founding the California Wine Institute, and one more, Medical Friends of Wine. And he wrote The Wines of America, which is one of the early, most important post-Prohibition books about wine, written for consumers. Axel, you want to add to that?
Yes, this book went into 4 editions. It's credited with being the first book that broadly educates Americans to wine. One of the things that's been said about alcoholic beverages in the United States is that we're largely a beer and spirits drinking society. Wine is largely largely consumed on the coasts. And it's a beverage that Americans have to be educated to. And so his book, The Wines of America, sort of sets the standard for educating, being a book to teach people about wine. And of course, we see lots of these today, but this is the beginning of it, especially in the post-World War II period.
Yeah, and the last thing I will say about that, for anybody who can't read the quote, because the text is a little bit small, I'll go ahead and read it. So Adams said, "Anyway, the Sparborough booklet answered my quest. I was looking for a cause. There I found the cause. I would teach Americans to drink light wine with meals, and this went back to my childhood and my experience in Europe and so on. And I became gradually fascinated with wine. Another thing entered beside this. I went library hunting for books about wine." And one thing that I think Axel and I have both heard over and over again from wine writers who were very active in the 70s and the 80s was that or who were learning about wine in the 70s, was that they really didn't have a lot to read. There weren't a whole lot of books out there, especially those kind of coming up in the mid 70s into the late 70s. So I love this declaration or confession by Adams. I went library hunting for books about wine because we've heard that many times. And often there's one book about wine that a wine writer who ended up becoming very well established and influential has held on to and will bring out and talk about, because that was maybe the first book that they found, or the only book that was readily available to them, that was interesting enough that it set them, and educational enough that it set them on this uh, course and this career that they never would have imagined kind of falling into pursuing.
And it's important to note that many of the books that were being written about wine at this time, when Adams was starting out, and certainly when Frona was writing, books were being written about European wines. They weren't writing about the wines of America or the wines of California. So here are two California writers writing about domestic wine. And through that, you then over time see the emergence of California becoming a preeminent wine growing region. I think many people kind of think that it's always been that way. Napa has always been there, always making wine, always top rated and things like that. And that hasn't been the case. It's been an evolutionary kind of thing. And it's largely, the wine industry has largely been helped by people writing about it. Leon Adams was also a great storyteller. And when I picked up the papers, he told a story about this particular photograph. And this photograph, I think of as being sort of quintessentially California, especially in the backstory behind the photograph. So what you're seeing here is a boxcar in Asti, so it's up in Sonoma. It is the first boxcar of wine that is going to be going back to the Eastern market, to New York, post-Prohibition. And so Leon said, he told a story behind this. He said, I was in San Francisco and somebody told me that there was this boxcar full of wine up in Asti that was getting ready to leave to go back to the New York market. And it was going to be the first shipment of California wine after Prohibition. So he said, the first thing that I did was I went to the San Francisco Opera and I got as many Italian peasant dresses as they would loan me. And I put them in my car and I started driving north. And I started picking up young ladies along the way. And once I got up there, I dressed them in these, or had them put on these dresses, and I had them stand around on the boxcar, and we took this picture. So it is so manufactured history. It is so California in its origin. It tells a story that is both true and not true. Asti was created by Sarbono and a couple of other Italian businessmen who were successful businessmen in San Francisco to be a place for Italian immigrants to go to get established in California. Hence the name Italian Swiss Colony. It's named for a town in northern Italy, but it never really became a colony. The Italian immigrants would work there, take their pay and leave, go elsewhere, although they had the option to stay and own part of the land. So there's these wonderful stories and things behind the photograph and understanding sort of how it weaves in and out of California. So I love this photograph, and I every time I see it, I'm reminded of Leon telling this story. We were sitting in his apartment in Sausalito. I think we just finished loading the boxes of his archives into the van. And he said, well, you got a few minutes. And I think a few minutes turned into a couple of hours listening to his stories. So I'll turn this back over to my colleague, Jullianne, who will tell you another story.
You can tell this with me, Axel. You have a big part in this. We wanted to take you into the archives, just give you a little bit of a taste of what's in Leon Adams' papers or what we found among them. So Adams what is like the ideal writer, because he kept everything. He kept all of the clippings that he used to write his books, all of his research. He kept all of his correspondence. He kept photographs. One thing I was so kind of tickled to find in the archive were these small, strips of paper with typewritten notes about wineries and winemakers that he'd visited. So he would just drive all over California to track down these wineries that were off the beaten path or just upcoming. And you can really, it's very touching to find these early conversations that he had with winemakers that ended up becoming really foundational for California wine and what we think about as California wine. Shortly after I arrived at the library, somebody passed a manuscript along to me, and that's what you're looking at on the left or perhaps the right for you. This is actually a large piece of butcher paper. Here it's been folded in 4, and it appeared there was very little information about it. So the author was Cameron. His last name is Cameron, James Cameron, and Frank Cameron. And there was no date on the manuscript. Really weren't sure where it had been published. We found out later that it was perhaps published in a magazine called Cosmopolitan that fell out of print a couple decades ago. But reading through the manuscript, it tells a seemingly like apocryphal story about this wine tasting in Paris that happened, and you can read a little bit about it on this sheet, that happened in the early, sorry about that. Let's see if we can, I knew we'd have some technical problems. Let me see if I can get that back. Okay. So this tells a story about a wine tasting that happened in Paris, perhaps in the 60s, perhaps earlier, where a California Chardonnay bested Burgundy in a blind tasting at dinner. And we know that the host was a diplomat, and the dinner guests were, if not connoisseurs, they were French and they knew wine. So this reads as, you can feel the excitement in this manuscript. I think this is one of, there were so many tastings, blind tastings, aside from the Judgment of Paris, that pitted California wines against French wines. But I think that this was one where the word got out. And you can just imagine it being sort of whispered around, talked about at the wineries, talked about in towns like St. Helena. And what is also exciting about it is a number of early California wineries are named in the manuscript. And one of them, the winery that produced this wonderful Chardonnay, was Hansel, which was owned by James Zellerbach, who had been owner of a paper company and decided that he wanted to found a winery that would make Chardonnays and Pinot Noir in the French style. So he hired a winemaker named Brad Webb, whose brother worked at UC Davis. Dinsmore Webb was a professor in the viticulture and enology program. And Brad brought in a lot of new technologies that up to that point had not really been accepted in California wineries and weren't even that popular in France, because they were innovative, they were experimental. One of those was the jacketed fermenter. So he was working with stainless steel fermenters to control the temperature of the winery. He was also one of the first California winemakers to practice controlled malolactic fermentation on the wines. And he also almost exclusively used French barrels, French oak, which, as you know, was, or may know, was instrumental in creating this kind of California flavor, what became a California flavor for Chardonnay. So the Chardonnay in this manuscript is important because you see California looking to France, but also creating wine in a California, distinctly California style that is perhaps has echoes of French wines, but is also unique unto itself. On the right side is a photograph that I found among Leon Adams' papers, and this is Hansel Winery in the background. We don't know who is standing in the foreground. It doesn't look like Zellerbach. The person is not identified on the back of the photograph. There's actually no information about it. But talking with wine experts or wine historians in California, they guess that this winery was probably, the photograph probably dates around the 1960s, which would have been the time of this tasting. You want to add anything to that, Axel?
No.
So we also found among Adams' papers, really kind of randomly, close to the photograph, these two letters that talk about the tasting that's described in Cameron's essay or article. This one is from Merrill Cody, who is the diplomat who hosted the dinner. And he's writing to James Zellerbach excitedly, telling him about what happened and telling him your wine was, people didn't know that this was a California wine. They thought it was a French wine. 3 out of the 5 attendees at that dinner picked his wine out as the Burgundy, and the Burgundy as the California wine. And if you can't read this letter, he says, afterwards, we discussed the relative merits of the 2 wines and decided that your wine will stand up with any Burgundy. Yours is, of course, slightly lighter in body than the Courtin Charlemagne, but that would not be true if it were compared with the Montrachet, which it was your aim to produce. So this is a historically important letter because it says something about what Zellerbach was trying to do. It's very revealing. And it also says a little bit about, I think, the arbitrariness of these tastings, which have gone down in history as myth, but at the time were kind of like games, really. After that, we have a letter from W.H. Peterson, who I believe was the father of Joel Peterson, founder of Ravenswood. And he was part of a tasting group in San Francisco. And the letter is addressed to Brad Webb, who made the Hansel Chardonnay. He was the winemaker. And in the letter, Peterson says, we want to compliment you on that 1957 Chardonnay. It was a great wine. And he also mentions the tasting. He says it was mistaken for the Montrachet by experts. So you can see how French dinner attendees become experts in California gossip circles in wine country. So it's very interesting. And he also asks for a bottle of Webb's Pinot Noir.
So here you have a tasting that predates the Judgment of Paris by 16 years. And it's showing that there's already this comparison that's going on. The other thing that I find so marvelous about this story is that manuscript that Jullianne started this with is something that came on a list of items from I'm really sorry, I can't remember who sent it to me, but a book dealer in the Bay Area sent me a list of items that they had for sale. And one of the things was this 4-page manuscript, and it was $25, I think. Is that
It was
right?
$25, yeah. And it was undated. And we can use these letters from Leon Adams' papers to date that manuscript, which is cool.
So, you know, at the time I thought $25, I'll risk $25. And now I feel like I've made a wonderful purchase, but I have to confess it was completely by accident. But it shows the kind of serendipity that happens when you're working with these kinds of collections, and the value of having these collections to then cross connect with other items and complete the story.
Right. And I also want to pull out one other line from Peterson's letter in case the text is too small for you to read. He says, "It amazes me that so fine a wine was produced in California. And I wonder what unusual care was needed to obtain this superlative product." So one other aim of the Wine Writers Collection at UC Davis is to trace the development of fine wine in California, to trace that arc and to create something of a timeline, so to speak, of the evolution of wine pre-Prohibition, through Prohibition, post-Prohibition, into the 80s and the 90s. So what happens, what these letters reveal is that with the technology that Webb was using, which Peterson alludes to not exactly knowing, but he understands that Hansel Winery was doing something different in the production within the winery. They were thinking about wine production differently. And that was resulting in fine wine. So you have technology that's producing an aesthetic product that now can compete on a global scale.
You're really seeing the emergence of California wines from being known regionally to now having a place on the international stage. Warren Winiarski's Cabernet Sauvignon was the top-ranked red wine in the 1976 Paris tasting called the Judgment of Paris. So it's more than fitting that the position that he established at Davis, that Jullianne holds, uncovered this earlier link to California French wines on that. But California in this time period, a lot of people are working very hard to create fine wines and to basically put California on the international stage. It's not that California wines beat French wines, it's that California wines and French wines are peers on that. So I think that we've finished our talk, and if there are questions, Kevin will be taking those questions.
I'm back. I'm back to, first of all, say thank you for such a fascinating presentation. I think you've certainly shown that wine journalism and wine criticism and the entire wine industry is indeed alive and thriving now, but it also has some really interesting, some fascinating origins, especially in these two wine writers. And we do have some questions a little bit about the wine writers, about some other topics. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask one of the first questions, which was about Frona, and questions about what else did she write? I mean, she clearly wrote this incredible book. And what was her training and background? It appears like both of your subjects tonight started out in the newspapers.
You know, I don't know of any formal training that she had. I don't know that she was a graduate of even a high school on that. That's not necessarily what people would have had at that particular time period. So I don't know what her formal education was. She did write on a variety of things, including geology of all things, but I think she was writing about a particular geographic or geologic feature in the Napa area. So she was I would say she's primarily writing about Northern California. She does write about California wines other than the book. But I would imagine, well, I found a reference saying that she had the woman's beat for the San Francisco Examiner. That sounds highly sexist. That is not my word. That's not my phrase. But you know, she's one of two women writers at the time for the San Francisco Examiner. So she's clearly groundbreaking, and that's why it's quite jarring in my mind that she's an anti-suffragette.
And Jullianne, you mentioned a little bit in the last letter about how people wrote about and the terminology, I guess, about California wines. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the language and the terminology that was used to write about wine here in California, and how it may be different than the way the terminology was used in Europe, for example?
Well, one thing that I found very fascinating that I didn't know before I got to Davis was how instrumental some European wine writers were in championing California wine, including Michael Broadbent, Hugh Johnson, Jancis Robinson, Hugh, I think especially. In some cases, these European writers seem to, maybe because they had a broader, more varied tradition with wine or history of wine, and had tasted a little bit more, but seemed to recognize that something was happening in California that was interesting. Often, I think, maybe before Californians did. But you did see in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, there's another early wine writer, Ruth Ellen Church, who is writing for the Chicago Tribune, and I think had the first wine column, or at least one of the first. And she was writing quite a lot about California wines, as well as international wines, but she was also writing a lot about food. So in these earlier wine writing, you see a lot of food and wine writing. So wine columnists were also food columnists. And then wine books, people who were writing the books often came from a background of writing about something else entirely, such as sports. So the writing, I think there was a lot more storytelling there, a lot more writing about the people, the places, trying to develop a legible history of California wine. And I think that writing moved more toward typicity and these flavor descriptions that I think is really rampant now, and maybe not quite seeing some of the more the same kind of narrative storytelling in journalism that was popular in the 80s, especially, and in the 70s, and the kind of beat writing.
Can you talk briefly about the impact of both of these writers on, I guess, on the public? Did it help? Did their writing increase consumption? Did it increase other people joining in writing about the wine industry and wine criticism?
Well, Leon Adams is considered the dean of California wine writers. So he's sort of begins the post-war tradition that we have now, starting with the post-war and going on through that. So I think he's very influential in getting people started. Unfortunately, most people today don't know who he is. So this is one of the things that I'd hope we could bring out. I think that Wait, on the other hand, I'm not sure what her impact is. We don't have consumption data. We have some production data that we can look at. So it's really harder to measure what her impact was. I will say this though, she is heavily used in most histories that are written today about individual areas. She documents those areas and describes those areas. Charles Sullivan, a wine historian, the second edition of his History of Napa is probably the best history of Napa, in my opinion, and he uses her quite a bit. So she's a major source for current writers today on that.
Great.
Yeah.
Did you want to add to that, Jullianne?
I will just add quickly that an archive that the library acquired earlier this year, the papers of Dorothy Gator and John Brecher, who wrote for the Wall Street Journal through the 90s. And I would think that they were very important in kind of bridging the older forms of wine writing with the future current wine writing. So they both started off as hard news writers, wrote about wine on the side, and eventually that became their full-time job and very popular column. And then another writer who later than Leon Adams, I think, was Alexis Bespaloff, who is extremely influential for a lot of wine writers who were writing in the 70s and the 80s. His name comes up all the time, but unfortunately his papers are perhaps lost. So he might be forgotten. We hope not. We'll celebrate him.
Can you talk briefly about the California Wine Institute?
The California Wine Institute. We recently acquired a segment of their papers. They have kept their legal, business, and internal governance papers, which they should. But the other papers that they have, and this goes back to the immediate post-Prohibition period, we picked those up over a series of visits to San Francisco over the last 18 months before the pandemic set in. We made 11 or 12 trips in my pickup and picked up 25 to 30 boxes each trip. So it's an immense collection of material. So we have that, and we will be processing that and making that available. So, but what is the Wine Institute? The Wine Institute is an advocacy group for the California wine industry. And they were based in San Francisco with an office in Sacramento for state lobbying and an office in Washington, D.C. area for federal lobbying. There's an interesting story that I encountered that A.P. Giannini, the founder of Bank of Italy, Bank of America, or Bank of California, Bank of Italy, or Bank of America now, a San Francisco person. When wineries and vineyards wanted to borrow money from him, and his bank was a major agricultural lender on this, he would say, "Well, are you a member of the Wine Institute?" If they weren't, then he wouldn't deal with them. So they had to join in order to get a loan or something along those lines. So he was instrumental in getting that. But for a long period of time, the Wine Institute, virtually everybody in the wine industry was a member of the Wine Institute. So both growers and winemakers. And it did education function, it did a promotion function, it did a legal function. It was basically helping the wine industry in a number of different ways. One of the interesting things within the collection is there's a book by Alice Hobart Tisdale called Cup of Gold, and it's about Napa. It's a novel about Napa during Prohibition. And a movie was made in the 60s with Claude Rains and Rock Hudson called this, I believe it's This Earth Is Mine. Well-known film, I'm sure all of you know it. So the Wine Institute partnered with the people that made the film, and we have photographs of displays of wine in theater lobbies for the film to promote California wine. So in the collection is a script for the movie, the promotion plan that had been developed, the idea of tying a film event to an industry, which I think is rather interesting. And I don't think that we would have displays of an alcoholic beverage in a theater lobby today. So there are those kinds of things that are preserved in it that are, again, wonderful parts of California. And there's all California, or the Wine Institute also ran a Wine Queen program up until about 25 years ago. And so there's pictures of the California Wine Queen, and that's a whole nother story on its own.
Yeah, you could do a whole presentation on that. Well, so we're at the top of the hour. We're at 6:02, and we're going to wrap up, but I think we can maybe squeeze in a couple of these last questions because they're all forward-looking, right? They're all about the future. And the first one is pretty common question, I think, is, what is the wine industry doing proactively now for the wineries and the vineyards, given the fires, the threats from the fires, and the probably intensifying and increasing threats in the future from fires?
Well, I know that the University of California, Davis is working with wineries, especially in the area of smoke taint, because that's a problem. Smoke getting on the grape. The grape skin is actually very porous and absorbs it into it. The library partnered with the Robert Mondavi Institute in a program series called Savor, and our second program, and it's recorded and available through the library. But one of the people presenting was Anita Oberholzer, who's our extension enologist, talking about the effect of smoke taint on this. So that's one of the things that we're doing with it. There's a number of other things. The library is involved to the extent in supporting the academic and outreach programs on the campus in working with the wine industry.
Yeah, I can imagine you're quite involved on a number of different levels with what's happening up there. The other fun forward-looking question, which I'll pose to you, is it says, given that California wines kind of came out of nowhere in the 1970s, at least kind of internationally, this participant, Mark, is curious if there are any regions in the US or internationally that today could be poised to be like the next up-and-coming wine region.
I'm going to let my colleague answer that.
It's a fun question.
I'm going to put her on the spot. She has firsthand knowledge.
Well, I actually have a very strong connection to Texas wine. And I will say they've taken a little while to find their footing, but a lot of winemakers and growers in Texas have realized how well Portuguese varieties do out there. And they're producing some Spanish varieties as well. So Texas wine is probably going to be on the map with a little bit of a better reputation, I would predict, in the next 10 years. And it really is going to have a lot to do with winemakers working with less conventional or popular varieties that do well with the Texas soils and climates. I also really think Washington. I mean, I went to college in Walla Walla, and I visited again. I went back about a year ago, and I was so impressed by a lot of the Walla Walla wines that I had. So Eastern Washington would be a region to watch for sure. And I know more Europeans are starting to buy vineyard properties out there.
Wow. So you heard it here first. Texas and Eastern Washington are the next up and coming wine regions, from Jullianne and Axel and the Book Club of California. So I want to thank both of you, Axel, Jullianne. This was so great. There are some other questions in the chat, and I'm going to send them to you afterwards. I know we're also providing your contact information to all the participants. So you may hear from some folks who didn't get their questions answered because of time, but also I'd like to know some of the answers myself, and I could even get back to some of the participants. So I'll be following up with you after this. So again, thank you so much. This was terrific. This was great. Thank you. And I just want to also thank everyone for attending this Book Club of California program tonight. I hope you'll join us for our next online program, which is Bunker Hill, Los Angeles, Essence of Sunshine and Noir. And that's on Thursday. It's an unusual night for us. This Thursday, October 15th, from 5 to 6:15 p.m. It's also going to be here on Zoom. This is going to be a live online presentation that is co-presented by the Pasadena Public Library. And it's going to be featuring author Nathan Marzak. Again, Bunker Hill, Los Angeles, by author Nathan Marzak this Thursday. You can register for the event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the Book Club of California. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Axel. Thank you, Jullianne. This was terrific. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Be well and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.